podcast, Inverted Orthodoxy.
It's me. Sorry, guys.
Do you want to try that again?
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Inverted Orthodoxy. This is our podcast where the three of us, Doug, myself, Blake, and Kyle, get to answer your questions as you send them in. And we enjoy it every week. This is something I look forward to just see what usually Doug and Kyle have to say about your questions, but I enjoy it very
Not
much.
this week. Little foreshadowing there.
Just a reminder, you can send your questions in through our website, which is invertedorthodoxy.com. There's a few different ways you can do it there. You can find us on anywhere that you listen to your podcasts. And as well, we like your feedback. So that's...
Speaking of feedback, we've got some AER.
Time for accusations, explanations, and recantations.
AER, accusations, explanations, and recantations. And very rarely is the AER we receive directed in the direction that it is pointed today.
I was so glad when I saw this come in.
Blake, this AER is focused at you.
Wow. Yes.
And
For the audio listeners, I'm full fist pumping.
So, this is what the AER says. Blake is wrong in saying that it is fine. Now, this is in response to the complementarianism, egalitarianism question we answered last week.
Yep.
Blake is wrong in saying that it is fine if the women feel valued and, air quotes, loved. Then complementarianism is fine. Blake, there is much value that is lost in what women could have done taking this position. I've seen many women be lazy in their spiritualism because they depend on men, especially their spouse.
That's interesting. I would say, honestly, I read this because Kyle showed it to me, and I've thought about it, and I got a big explanation. I don't know if I'll go to the whole thing, but it actually makes me sad. The question and the thought behind it, or that I'm reading behind it, makes me sad. I'll start by saying I was part of the Christian and Missionary Alliance denomination for a long time, and during that time, they went through the big debate and, I guess, discussion and deciding whether women could be ordained in that denomination. Basically, it was getting to the point whether a woman could be a lead pastor or fill that role. In the Christian and Missionary Alliance up until that point, women could do anything else.
But not be a lead pastor.
But not be a lead pastor.
Okay.
But they could be the head of they could be chairman of the board, they could be anything. And the board in the Alliance, which is interesting to me, is also hierarchically over the lead pastor.
Could they be in other pastoral roles?
All pastoral roles. Yes.
Okay.
So when I was privy to this and watched it happen, and the first general meeting that we went to, it was terribly ugly. That's what makes me sad about the question. Like, just people saying really horrific and hurtful things on both sides, and then others debating it and standing up for it. It was a mess. So they tabled it for 2 years and then came back to it. But I did a lot of research on my own through those times, because I was like, okay, what do I think, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting, and I say this quite a bit. My opinion about theology is often like theological camps, I think, come from a good intention, but then end up being lacking in what they view. And often competing theologies are so closely intertwined anyways that it's funny that we define them and say, oh, I'm over here and I'm over there.
Totally.
So this is what I believe I remember from complementarianism and egalitarianism, is that 1975 is kind of where egalitarian first gets used. The term comes out in somebody's writing, some theologian or pastor writes a book and says, this is what it is. And it was actually, the phrase was complementarian egalitarian. So, or complementary egalitarian, meaning that they thought, the author of that book or whatever, thought that it was complementary for men and women to work together in defined roles, using their strengths and weaknesses to work together. That was the idea behind it. Fast forward to 1988, the side that would probably more traditionally be called traditional or hierarchical way of thinking about men and women working.
Yep.
They stole complementarian.
Yeah.
And they said, yes, this is the way it should be. Men and women should work in roles that are defined and work within their strengths and weaknesses.
Yep.
Which is funny because now you have both sides kind of saying the same thing. Fast forward to 2024, and we have people, you could find them on YouTube, you could find them in your local church, who will pound the table and say, I am one or the other.
Yes.
Right? So I always think that's weird. And last week when I said that I thought, well, I have friends, family, I have people that I know well that live in the complementarian camp.
Yep.
And I believe, I know this listener can say I'm wrong, but I believe I know women who are fine and do feel valued in that system. And maybe this says they're not, maybe they're being lied to, maybe they don't see the light, I don't know, but I'm just telling what I know. I know there's women that are okay in that camp. But then the second part of this makes me sad as well, because it talks about women being lazy in their spiritualism because they've been forced down or knocked down by men or whatever, which, yeah, abuse on either side is wrong. But I also think believing that you have rights or that you deserve something in your spirituality also sits really not well with me. Like, that's what I watched in that debate that day. I remember that auditorium. I think we were in Winnipeg when people like said, I have the right to, and women have the right to, and men have the right to. And I was like, what are we talking about? Like,
Yeah.
we're supposed to be a bunch of surrendered pastors that believe God is our king. And I really do think that in our, culture, we live in a democratic culture, and it hurts us in understanding that God relationship with people, because we get a vote. And if we don't like how the vote goes, we get to lobby our government and tell them that they're wrong and they need to listen to us.
Or vote in a new government.
And we have a right and we deserve. If you lived in a place where there's a king, you don't get to do that. Like, the king says,
Yep.
and you get to decide whether you just want to live against the king, which probably doesn't go well for you, or whether you want to live in surrendered submission to the king.
Yep.
And if the king is loving and good and not abusive, that can work. And I think that is a picture of what God is. And I think if you want to take the position of complementarianism and say that that is a picture of how God defines roles in our world, and you're a surrendered Christian, then you work in a surrendered way, and I think it can work. So I guess people can say I'm wrong, but that's where I land
So
today.
my question in response to that would be, so you're saying we're people who God is our king, Jesus is our king, right? Christ is Lord, and all of the implications of that statement, which oftentimes we don't think about. So I guess my question would be, there are people in the complementarian camp who would say Christ is Lord and Christ wants complementarianism.
Yeah.
And there's people in the egalitarian camp who would say Christ is Lord and he wants egalitarianism.
Yeah,
What do you do with that?
Well, I'll define better what I meant by that. I would say that if Christ is my Lord and he has rules that I would decide in my Bible for myself personally that I should abide by, and if it causes me to be lazy in my spiritualism, I wouldn't say I'm living a very good Christian walk. So I'm using that to say, in the same way that if you were in the complementarian camp and you just got lazy in your spiritualism, I'm like, you're not living a true Christian walk.
Yeah.
You should be able to define or figure out ways to live fully into Christ
Yeah.
under submission that's why I said
Okay.
Can I jump in with you a bit?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll say this as I think, large proponent for egalitarianism. I also know the opposite of this to be true, of the weak side of it, where because the man doesn't have to be the head of the home, Well,
Oh, yeah.
my wife's spirituality is her own thing, and my family's spirituality, she can take a role. So, what your common view in your egalitarian churches has typically been, in my observance, and I think probably statistically backed, would be that the men just have become lazy in their spirituality. And so, I've seen many homes where the woman is by far the spiritual head of the home. Not that that's necessarily right or wrong in this egalitarian conversation, but that seems to be much more the default because, like, well, she's putting in the effort, and he just kind of has laid back. Versus, I do see in complementarian environments and people that I look up to, they have a strong, because of the call and responsibility they understand, they then live that out for their families and all that. And so I see men who are putting more effort in their faith more consistently in the complementarian camps to help with their families. So I'll say there's a positive that I see. I will jump in with you and say that I do know complementarian marriages that I see to be beautiful, loving examples of how two people would submit their lives to one another as we submit our lives to Christ, the head of the church. And statistically, again, this is jumping into some stuff from The Great Sex Rescue as well as other books I've come across. People have the theological camp they land in, and then they have how they live. And so on paper, how most people will say, the man makes all the decisions at our home because we're a complementarian household, they actually take one another's opinion into consideration quite heavily because they're two loving people. And so I don't care what camp you land in. If you have Christ as your king and I become somebody who I have a partnership with this person, I want to hear their voice, I want to listen to them, I'm going to ask of their opinion. And I may be complementarian in theology, but I'm living, caring for and nurturing with the softness and gentleness of my heart because Christ is working in me. Doesn't matter what theological camp you're in. So I do think, and I can affirm, there are lots of people who I see in complementarian spaces that live a beautiful Christ-like marriage. That doesn't mean it all is always the case, and complementarianism has been abused as much as egalitarianism has been as well. Like, there's no perfect system that says, here's the theology, now we've got a great marriage. That's not how it works. So I'm with you, Blake. I do get it.
So the problem in every system is never the system. It's the people in the system, right? I would be firmly egalitarian. That's where I would land.
Yep.
But if you come out of a toxic complementarian church setting or marriage setting, it'd be easy to say egalitarian is the way to go.
Totally.
But if you come out of a toxic egalitarian church or family setting, you could go the other way. Instead of realizing that the issue is never the system. And so often we want to make if we could just get the right system, all would be well. The system is never the problem.
No.
The people in the system are always the problem. I'm not saying I'm complementarian, firmly egalitarian. But I would say that if you have, that it's possible to have love and have health in any setting where the people are pursuing love and health by the grace of God.
Yeah, that's where I'd be.
I think personality plays a role into it too. Like Allie and I have long talked about, there's a lot of function where I am the leader of our home, not because theologically either of us are complementarian. I'm just naturally wired to be a little bit more leader-like, and she's happy to, we talk about our jobs regularly. It's like, I would never want to be a manager, she says. It's like, because I just want to come in, be told my job, do it, and then go home. Like, that would drive me insane. So just how we're wired fits along those lines. And so I don't know. I would assume there might be some of that fits into along gender lines, more defaulting to two directions.
Maybe, but you have type A personality, men and women.
I'm not at all painting universe. I'm just saying, if you are to lay out statistical averages, do they lay out that way? And so does that help work in some environments? And I'm not painting. I'm not saying that there's not ways that this could be abused, but I see how that could work, and there are generalities amongst our population.
Absolutely.
So, do you think as well, like as you guys are talking, I'm thinking more here, culturally, this may be just my belief, but in my lifetime, I would assume most marriages work in some way, that they're role defined, probably more egalitarian as far as theology goes, in that they just work that way. The women do the things that they're strong at, the men do the things they're strong at, and we're okay with working together. That would be secular or Christian in the culture that I believe I live in. Most households that I'm aware of probably work that way. I don't know if it would be the same like 100 years ago.
Right.
Like, I think just probably culturally, men had more authority, and it was just that's the way the household probably ran, was a little more men were the leader, and that's the way it was. Probably secularly and Christian as well. Would that be a fair guess?
Possibly. It's hard to say. Like, we have our stereotypes of how things were 100 years ago.
Yeah, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
I watch movies and read books. Like,
But
I wasn't
the
there.
movies that you're watching are all written by people who are our age, who weren't there 100 or 200 years ago
that's
as
what I'm
well,
saying,
right?
yeah.
So I don't know.
So some of the stuff that I read on early church on these kind of environments, like how now the picture is painted back to the 40s and 50s, where women only ever worked in the home, and like that was not how the early church functioned. Like, those women were maybe working out of the home, but they were running a business that then did things, and so there was very much a different mentality. I think any healthy. I also think back to like my wife's grandma, who had 11 kids. Those kids all had to do something to keep the house going. So if the wife's role was to do these things, like, it was just a matter of survival. There's just as much business built into the family as there was like defined roles. It was like, we all need to do these things to survive. So if you can do those things, awesome. I'll go out and do these things. I think there was just much more survival tactic than there was the space to just sit and luxuriously think about which theological camp we work in and then define our roles based out of that versus what do we do to survive.
I think about if you could go back 100 to 150 years in Airdrie.
Yep.
Like, what was required? You probably like got up early, though everyone in the family.
Yep.
You worked till bed and then fell asleep exhausted.
Yep.
Like, that was just life.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like, well, that's your job, dear. Like,
Because I'm the man. Like, I just don't see that working.
I think that, I think that we have the opportunity. And certainly, I'm not saying there isn't a patriarchal history. There absolutely is.
Yep.
But we also have to recognize the world was radically different than what it is today.
I think there's much more leaning then towards biological lens too, that we don't have to depend on as much. Go as far back as hunters and gatherers. Which gender is going to take the role there? Think based on strength, size, speed, risk of danger. Men are typically going to be the hunters. Women are going to be functioning as the gatherers. Like, that's what we see based on biological and genetic predispositions based on those genders to do those roles that fit for them, not because theologically that's what they had decided was right. Like,
I think there also was social implications.
Of
so
course.
if you had the woman who was the type A personality who maybe would have wanted to go be the hunter,
totally.
they would have never had the opportunity. So there is an advancement and a
Absolutely.
change that's
You're right
taken
there.
place. And
Good
there was a
clarification.
social pressure that came with, you are a woman, you need to do this. You are a man, you need to do that.
Correct.
And in that regard, there was oppression there. 100%.
Yep.
That I think probably what happened is those women and men who were outside of the statistical norm for gender stereotypes were the ones who were oppressed and maybe felt oppressed, but maybe didn't even have time to think about it. Like, I think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And I remember being in Bible college and learning about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we're in the 21st century where we have all of those base level needs met, that we can start thinking about these existential questions that I wonder 200 years ago if they were like, you don't think about whether or not you were made for this when you're trying to find supper.
Totally.
Yes, and when we, again, write books or put movies together of what it would be like back then, sometimes we take for granted that, right? I think I've seen that in movies where I think there's been a luxury of a kid being like, well, I'm going to rebel against the norms of society or whatever. And you're like, when you say that, you're like, probably not, because your mom and dad were like, no, you're going to eat. Like, and so to eat, get your butt moving, right? Like,
Yes, I think about. Sorry, I was going to say. I think about my kids, right? And you ask your kid to help clean up after supper, and they act like it's the greatest injustice in the world.
Yes.
And I wonder if that happened 150 years ago, when, like, you just from a very early age were given work that you had to do that you knew this is part of our family survival.
Yeah.
I don't know.
yeah, who knows?
I think that there have definitely been things that lean people towards in marriages and relationships towards certain responsibilities over time that we've been talking about. But then the downside is when we then go, so this is how it is, this is how it always will be.
Right.
And then we lock it in and base it again and justify it with some theology so we can never ask that question. And it just came back to mind of, as far as I can remember, John Wesley's shift on ordaining women and his mentality towards that, his practical view shifted before his theological one did. And so he started to see women who had incredible gifts and calls and were walking in things of the Spirit and gifts of the Spirit. So, well, who am I to deny this? Yeah. And so it was that kind of exemplified it. And so I think the softness of his heart is one that goes, okay, if I have this theological thing, but I see my wife as a real gifting in pick whatever, as a complementarian, I think a healthy complementarian with an openness to the Spirit, watching what the Spirit is doing in his wife's life, could say, no, that may have not been the typical gender role that I would have assigned, but this works. And so I think instead of just locking it down by a theological camp, seeing what the Spirit's doing and keeping our openness to see what the Spirit has gifted each person to do is a helpful balance.
Well, I think that addresses one of the issues, and maybe we're rabbit trailing here, that is in the 21st century evangelical church, in that we've gotten away from the Wesleyan quadrilateral, which was scripture, experience, common sense, and tradition.
Tradition and reason, experience.
Common sense, reason, And in some fundamental circles, it's like scripture, period. And not just scripture, my interpretation of scripture, period. And that's problematic. You see in the story you share about Wesley, his practical view changed, and then he went back and his theological view changed. Sometimes in the church today, you're not allowed to change.
Correct.
No matter where the Spirit of God might be breaking out, how the Spirit of God might be breaking out, you'd be like, no, you're not allowed to do that, Holy Spirit. You're contradicting my understanding of Scripture.
Totally.
Totally. But
our theology should never excuse or justify our bad behavior. I think anytime that is happening, your theology is not good. Right? It's just not.
I think we should hold it all up at open hand, right?
Yeah. All right, well, let's move on to our new questions for today. First one is, what advice would you give individuals currently dating someone or pursuing a date? And what should a Christ-centered relationship look like? What's some things you wish you had done differently in your own experiences?
Well, there's two questions here. I think the answer to the first one, when I think about it, is if you want a Christ-centered relationship, I think the most fundamental thing is to love that person, commit to loving that person. And what do I mean by that? Because we're all like, oh, yeah, I'll love them. And then they get this sentimental, sappy view of love, which is garbage. To love someone is to joyfully and sacrificially put their best interests first, even at the expense of yourself, with no thought of what you're going to get in return. That's love. And too often what we call love is not love. I think of C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce. There's this one interchange between a woman. The husband says to her, didn't you love me down there being back on earth? And she said, no. Most of what we called love was really us just trying to be nice to get people to like us. Now I'm paraphrasing. But that little exchange was radical for me and challenged me and convicted me for months on end. So much of what we say is love is really us being nice, either because we're insecure or because we're hoping to get something out of the niceness that we're offering.
I don't disagree with anything you're saying, Doug, but if I could back us up a minute. So let's say this person's trying to or pursuing a date. Like they're not committed to loving this person. Like how do you go about doing that in a Christian way?
Yes, you love the person. You seek their best interests first. You're supposed to love your neighbor. You don't wait to see if you're committed to them.
How do you it's true. How do you discern should I pursue having romantic love and interest in this person? Like I'm just trying to back up to the very beginning of this date. If I were to be looking to date again, like, how do you begin doing that in a Christ-like way? Like, are you sending people, jump on Tinder like everybody else and start scrolling through? Like, how do you begin that seeking process
I
in a
don't
Christ-like
think
way?
that there's a right or a wrong external way. I think, again, the world has changed since I last dated, which was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And now there's people who meet on online dating sites.
Yep.
And I remember the first time that I talked to people who got married, who met on an online dating site. And I was like, is this doomed to failure? Like, this just seems really sketchy to me because it was brand new. I think you could have an interest in someone that you see on Match.com. You could bump into someone at the store and start talking to them. I don't know. I think that there has to be some sort of interest.
Yes.
Or you're not going to go on a date.
Yes. Fair.
So I'm assuming that there is some sort of chemistry that's happening there, or at least openness to the possibility of developing chemistry.
Yes.
Or you're going to be like, nah, I'm good.
Fair.
And I would say, if you're going to do things in a Christ-like way, if someone asks you on a date and there's really no interest there and there's really no possibility of interest there, then the Christ-like thing to do is be honest with that person and say no. Don't lead them. Don't lead them along.
Yeah.
But again, that's just love.
Yeah.
I'm doing what's in your best interest.
Yeah. I think of two different starting places you could be from, and so you may have to overcorrect depending on where you're starting. I know some people who, when they were dating, it was waiting for the clear indication that this is the God-ordained person and waiting for writing in the sky, like, this is it. And I'm not saying that can't happen or hasn't happened, but as I've chatted with people over time, I go, I think it's okay to be young and want to date and like be curious. And so you can de-spiritualize it a bit and go, if I am being refined by Christ, the fruit of the Spirit is in my life and I want to love this person, you can do that as long as you're honest throughout the process. I think other people may be too casual and going like, I'm just going to date whatever. And there's no Christ-likeness in that attitude of like, I'm just going to keep trying this out. So maybe you get to go, there is a purpose and there is a value in this relationship. You need to consider Christ-likeness and how you treat people and how you pursue people and back to what you're looking for. So depending on where you're starting, you almost have to adjust from those two extremes to opposite directions. So then I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
I've thought lots about this question over the years, especially because I was a youth pastor or in youth ministry for like 20 years. So talking to teens, I mean, they ask this question like daily.
As a dad of teens and young adults.
And then, yes, having my own kids who are now young adults, like, yeah, I've had many advice that was probably terrible, and I've had some that might have been good. But currently, I think of my own kids, and like the two big things that I continue to think are probably good in advice, or that I currently hold as good advice, is one, I ask them regularly not to have any regrets in their dates. Yeah. And I think that is the Christ-likeness, right? Like if you know, especially my male sons or my sons, you know, if you do something sexually or whatever else and you get to a place where you've crossed lines that are wrong in your mind, you're going to regret that, right? If you cause that girl to think differently, you're going to regret that. Yep. If you say bad words, if you whatever, all the things, like you should be able to get to the place, like you said, Doug, where it's like, yeah, I'm not interested in this person anymore. I'd like out of this relationship, and be able to walk out of the relationship without regretting something.
Yeah.
So I regularly remind them that my young adult kids, if they're going out to date someone, is don't have regrets. Treat them lovingly, right? And then secondly, if they've been dating someone for a bit, I just think it's good to know where that person came from as far as family, like history. Like, are their parents together? What were the family norms in their household? How did, roles get defined? All those things. How do they interact with siblings and close friends? What do they do when things are horrible, right? Yeah. Like when tragedy hits, like those kind of things, I don't know, make or break how you enter into a relationship or whether you're going to continue to pursue that relationship. But it's probably good stuff to know. I got that advice when I was dating, and I think it still probably holds true. Yeah. Just because there is some people that carry a lot more baggage than others, right? And if you enter into a relationship with that person and you love them, you're going to carry that baggage with them. So yeah, you need to decide whether that's something you're interested in or not. Yeah.
And I would say the other thing I would just throw out there is follow Jesus' advice about counting the cost in regards of like what you want the relationship to be down the road, make it up front. it's going to be like whatever you establish will become the norm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So if you're starting out and you want to be like just cool person, and then that's going to be the norm. And then down the road, you're like, I want to pray with this person. I want to do this. I want us to. Well, now you have to change that thing.
Yeah.
Habits are an incredibly powerful thing. I was talking to somebody yesterday, who was saying, every time I watch the Q&A podcast, you have the book Atomic Habits over your shoulder somewhere. I don't know where it is.
Yeah.
And they were asking if they could borrow it sometime, so I'm going to lend it to them. And it's such a fantastic book that just talks about how important habits are. And when I do premarital counseling, one of the things I always talk about is habits. If you can develop good habits, what happens is you will build into your marriage, and before marriage, into your relationship, effortlessly.
Yep.
You will be doing those things that without even thinking. That's what habits are.
Yep.
You will thoughtlessly be loving that person, as weird as that sounds.
Yep.
But it'll just be the habit is to love this person in whatever practical habit you might have done.
Yep.
On the flip side, if you create bad habits,
Yep.
you are going to, without any effort, sabotage your relationship.
Yep.
And so I think, while this isn't something directly related to Jesus, I think the wisdom of God would say, start down the path the way you want to end on the path.
Yeah.
That's good.
I think I don't know if it's intention with that, like, because I fully agree, but almost like on the other side of the coin, I don't know how it is. Also, just live in the moment for where that person is and who you are. Then I regularly talk with Ali, like, we're thankful it has worked out thus far, and we're so happy. But both of us are radically different people now than when we began to date, as life has shifted and changed us. And so, having expectations on somebody to be somebody who they are not yet, like especially if you're young and dating, it's okay to be 20 and not have everything figured out, and to be able to live in that moment of not having to see the person to be exactly who you want them to be, but have this grace about the imperfections of humanity that have to be grown into slowly over time. And you still are nowhere near perfect, but there's this beauty about getting to be at the start of that place and be flexible in it that I think I didn't have the eyes to see. I'm not saying we didn't live it out. I just didn't have the eyes to see and appreciate the stage of life we were in at that moment, starting to date.
But I think that I like that. I'm not disagreeing with that, but just to build on it.
Yeah.
You never stop becoming something.
No, totally.
And so, like, you have to continually date that person.
Totally.
Discover who that person is becoming.
Yep.
Because as you do that, you stay in love with that person.
Totally. Yeah. So not loving who they will be and
Not loving who they were.
used to be.
Yes.
Right. I'm loving you in this moment and building the relationship, and we're both being formed by this as we go along. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I just add to that and saying, like, whatever you define as good dating habits when you start dating should be the same habits you pursue and try to do throughout your marriage.
Yeah.
Like, you don't just quit dating once you get married.
Yeah. That I've read about it. Like trying to date now in the environment of things like Tinder, where you're literally swiping through, looking for and judging things on, like, there's always someone better in whatever capacity you're looking for out there. And so the idea to think of, well, this isn't working. She's not perfect right here, how she is. I should find somebody who fits me better this way. Like, I can't even begin to fathom how much that must be, and the weight of choice that we have seen in so many different things.
Yes.
That must be so difficult versus like, okay, I'm going to start dating this person. I want to stay open versus find one thing like that's wrong. Going back to scroll. Like that's,
well, we
why
want the composite of all of the things, and no person will be that person.
Totally.
And if you find the perfect person, they're not going to date you because you're not.
Correct.
Yeah, but Jesus was the only perfect person, and he was single. Yeah. There's a reason why.
I heard the joke about church is still my thing. If you find the perfect church, leave because you'll ruin it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Nice.
So,
what are some things you wish you'd have done differently in your own experience?
you guys are both looking at me, and I'll say, so when I think in the context of my relationship with Laura Lee, I don't think there's anything I would change. And maybe that sounds arrogant, and it's not meant to sound arrogant. We made a lot of mistakes, and I made a lot of mistakes and did a lot of dumb things. But but I'm very thankful for where that journey brought us.
Yep.
And I think if you change some of those things, you might not end up where you are. And we have had fun for over 28 years of marriage. There have been tough stretches and tough seasons, sure. When Jaden was going through his battle with cancer, that was a high stress, challenging time after he died. That was the worst time in our marriage. And I'm not wanting to diminish that, but there was still fun, and we were still together, and we've always liked each other. If I could do something different based on what you said, Kyle, I would have done less casual dating before I started dating Laura Lee.
Right.
Because I just would date anybody who would give me their number.
Yep.
And so that I would change. But I don't say this, like I say, with any sort of arrogance. I don't say this with any sort of like trying to sound good. But I was a little bit older than you guys when I got married. I was 26, and Laura Lee was 22. And there's a long story in how we ended up married that I felt very much like I had a responsibility before I married her. I could take you to the place I was standing in Oakland Mall outside of Detroit, Michigan, the moment when I knew I wanted to marry Laura Lee. And I was standing there with another girl that I was dating. Which is kind of weird, but Laura Lee and I were always friends, and I had asked her out on a date, and she said no, so I was dating other girls because she said no, and I was walking through this mall, and we were in this one spot, and I could literally take you to the same, assuming the mall's still there, I have no idea, I could take you to the exact spot, and this girl said something, and I looked at her, and it was like, what am I doing with you? I want to marry Laura Lee. And it was very shortly after that that I felt like God said to me, your responsibility is to spend the rest of your life loving her and showing her what love is. So I went into my marriage aspiring to do that and failing almost every day. But that has been the goal that I've set from the moment that I sat down with her and said, because I asked her to date, she said no, I was dating other girls. The next time we had a conversation, it was like, I'm supposed to marry you. Or I think I said, I want to marry you. And that freaked her out. And then there's a lot of in between there. But I went into it with that intentionality. And because of that, I look back on it and go, I screwed up a lot. Absolutely. I'm not saying that. But even though I was young and even though I was dumb, I am very thankful for the journey we've taken.
As you phrase it that way, and as I continue to think, I can't wish anything different back into it because I couldn't have been the person to be able to do those things, is kind of how I'm thinking of it. Like, all the mistakes and misgivings I had in those days of dating were because I was 19 and 20. Like, I couldn't have been myself.
Maybe you should. I said I was 26. You were, how old would you get married?
I was married before I even turned 21, just before I turned 21.
Blake, you were?
I was 21.
Yeah. See, when I was 21, I wouldn't have trusted me with a doll.
I'd be looking back, I probably would look at me like, dude, you are not ready for marriage. And so I'm very thankful. Like I've said to Allie many times, we have grown so differently from who we were when we got married. She's joked lots of times. She's like, I don't think you'd pick me if we were getting married now. Like if you were single and picking somebody, I'd say the same thing back. But I look back and I also go, I would not be the man that I am without all the refining that I've had through our dating and marriage process. That I just look back and go, to young Kyle, I wish you could have been better to love her better for longer and like not made some of those silly decisions. But I can't wish that back into that person because I wasn't yet able to be that person. So I know that's a weird like meta kind of way of putting it. So I wouldn't be like the things I have found about God's love for me and his confidence in who I am. And then out of that, how I get to love Allie all came as a result of her breaking up with me because I had no personality because I was just trying to find my identity in loving her and didn't have anything of myself to love her with. And so like these defining moments that have forced me to become who I am that give me the eyes to look back and go, I wish I could have done things differently. Yeah, you get the point.
And just before you answer, to say I don't when I read that, what are some things you wish you'd done differently?
Yeah.
I read that in the context of what you said, Blake. What are some things you regret?
Yes.
Yep.
And it doesn't say that.
And that's where I say I don't have. There's not things that I did that I regret. Did I make mistakes? Yes. Were there lots of times I hurt Lorelei? Sure. And I wish I hadn't.
Yep.
But I also know that through the process of working through that pain together,
Yep.
I learned how to love her better.
Yep.
Yeah. I think my dad told me, now he might not have, but this is what I believe I heard my dad say, was date as many girls as possible. And so I did. What someone else probably said
At least
to me,
I wish my dad had said that.
what someone did say to me and I did not hear or take in was that I should be friends with the people that I date or pursue. I did not do that. And I have many regrets, like, telling my kids don't regret a date. I'm like, oh, I regret a lot.
Right.
I treated girls horribly, and I treated my potential wife and then wife, Erin, pretty horribly too, because I didn't consider her a friend. I considered her like a date, or even when we got married, a wife, and I defined that terribly in my mind.
Right.
Thanks to my wife's loving and loyalty and just diligence, we stayed married. And so, I would look back and say, yes, I wish that I'd heard this podcast and listened to it. Because when I say those things, I say that quite regularly. If someone had only told me, and I'm like, what have I listened? I don't know, right?
I know I would not have.
So I don't know. But
Yeah.
I wish I would have taken the advice that
Yep.
was just given on this podcast, because I think I would have treated all girls much better.
I think so. Just to rabbit trail a little bit, we've referenced numerous times on this podcast Jesus and John Wayne,
Yep.
which is a book that really is a sobering read about evangelicalism.
Yep.
And while I really appreciated the book, there's some things that I was like, I feel like you're only showing the negative side of this thing. For me, one of the things before I ever met Lorelei was Promise Keepers, which I don't necessarily agree that everything Promise Keepers today was, because it was, I would say, very complementarian and very man is the head of the house and that sort of stuff. But I can remember being in a Promise Keepers conference in Pontiac, Michigan at the Pontiac Silverdome, and them talking about, like, as a man, it's your job to love your wife, and you need to love your wife, and you need to take responsibility to love your wife. And there was a heavy, heavy push on that. And I remember being like, that's a very solemn thing
Yep.
that you commit to do for the rest of your life. And that was before I ever met Lorelei.
Yeah.
And so I'd already had some of these moments where I didn't understand what I was necessarily committing to, but my heart was open to make that commitment and to figure out what it meant over the course of the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
It's good.
Maybe I should have waited till I was a little older. I also wonder, who was I tricking? Like, nobody told me I was too young to get married. Not one single person.
Well, we've been friends for a long time, and I remember early on in our friendship sitting around talking about how we ended up getting married as couples, because you and Aaron and Lorelei and I were friends.
Yeah.
And finding out that you were 21 and Aaron was 19, and I was like I don't know if my face conveyed the shock that I was feeling, because I was like 21.
Like, who are their parents?
Yes, like I was like, what is going on? How did anyone think that's okay? Because and I didn't know you when you were 21. Just for clarity's sake, I only knew what I was like at 21.
Yeah.
And now Lorelei at 22 was very responsible and mature, but Lorelei, like I've joked, she came out of the womb at 42 years old. She's always been very mature.
Yeah.
And that's just the way she is. So at 22, she was probably more mature than I still am. But there was, I remember hearing like 21. Like, I think to when I was 21, whew, I would not have done well.
But they also might have said things that you just also couldn't comprehend, or
That
like,
might
they're
be-
crazy, we're in love.
They were probably saying, like,
But we just
are
don't
you
remember.
sure you know what you're doing? And you were hearing, date as many girls as you can.
Because I'm sure there were people that when we got engaged were like, really? I don't know, but I don't remember. I remember a little bit of those feelings, but I don't remember directly saying it. But they probably said it as kindly as they could, and I just couldn't hear it.
I should clarify. There was one, Aaron's Uncle Mike. He was like, what the heck? And he told Aaron's parents, but Aaron's parents were like, no, they're mature, they're awesome. And I don't know what maturity means, but both Aaron and I are like leader personalities. So I think just to that point in life, the things we'd done well with responsibility and diligence.
Yeah.
So probably our parents or whoever did or didn't speak into our life thought we were okay.
Yeah.
Now, maturity in relationship, I obviously was lacking in a massive way, but yeah.
But on the flip side, so Melissa, who used to be a pastor here, and used to be on the podcast, if you go way back old school, was a regular contributor on the podcast.
Yeah.
She wrote a book, Sanctification in the Ordinary, I want to say it was
That's
called.
the subtitle, isn't it? Craft Inner Diapers and something else is
Yes.
the title? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was her master's thesis, and I read it, and it was really good. But in it, she talks about, and you're right, the subtitle is Sanctification in the Ordinary, how in the course of marriage and in the course of having their first child, God worked a lot of sanctification in her life. And I think when people said you guys were mature, you probably were but we don't know what we're getting into until we get into it, right? Like I've always said, once you're done high school, you should only have like 4 more birthdays at the most, because birthdays become meaningless, right?
Yeah.
There's post-secondary schooling, and then when you're done that's your next time that you age. Because if you go to college, you're the same age through all of college, and 6 months later, you look at college kids and you're like, you're such a child. Because
Yeah.
the next stage is you work full-time,
Yeah.
then you get married,
Yeah.
then you have kids,
Yeah.
then you're an empty nester, and you retire. Those are like, you stay in the same age for large chunks of time.
Yeah.
So maybe God would have worked in your guys' lives had you waited longer.
Yeah.
But some of the things you learned early in your marriage, probably the same things I learned early in my marriage, you're not going to learn until you're
Early in a marriage.
early in a marriage.
Yeah,
'Cause
true.
how else are you going to learn that thing?
Yeah, and I have friends that got married older, like in their early and even mid 30s, and that was a real difficult thing that they had to then unlearn these habits of a decade or more of living singly on their own for their own focus.
how would you-
Right?
yeah.
And then so just as much difficulty on that end as there is on the other side of things when you form and you're like going through this. I'm figuring out who I am. Hopefully, we still are together in the next 10 years because I might be wildly different. As I'm so established, how do I become different for you? There's a tension both sides.
Yeah, that'd be a really tough, because you would have a way of doing things
Totally.
that wouldn't even be your parents. Like you'd have dismissed all those and totally embraced your own.
Yep.
And then you have to be like, this isn't just my parents' thing. This is my thing.
Totally. Yeah.
I remember my buddy Dave, he didn't get married till he was like 30, but he phoned me one day and said, I need to get married. And I was like,
He said, I need to get married?
yeah.
Oh.
He was living in Los Angeles, had a very lucrative job, making lots of money, all the rest. And he said, because I'm really selfish. And then he went on to describe like how his days went and everything. I was like, oh yeah, like you're living the dream if you're a single guy.
Right.
But he realized that he needed to like take responsibility for other people and to like give out rather than just take in.
Right.
And I always remember that thinking
That's remarkable.
like that was so self-aware. Now I don't know
Yes.
Dave very well now, so I don't know how it's turned out, but man, I remember that and being like, "Whoa, that is a different way to enter marriage than I did," right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good for him.
Wow.
So
I need to get married. Kudos to him. Like that's not many people would ever come to that point of, like you say, of self-awareness,
Yeah.
Yeah.
of recognizing that selfishness in themselves,
Yeah.
and wanting to give God and another human space to deal with it.
Yes. We've got comments coming in from YouTube that I'm a few minutes behind on. Josie commented along, say, I agree with Blake. Statistical averages are dictated by culture, not capabilities or nature. And Doug, thank you. Kyle, there have always been some men who are less physically capable than women. Totally recognize that and speaking in generality. So thanks for watching and commenting along, Josie.
perfect.
You're welcome. I don't know what for. You're welcome.
Should we tackle another question today?
I don't think we can do 312. We could, according to the guesses, we could probably do 313 pretty quick.
All right. This is what the question says. Regarding the synoptic problem, do you think that Matthew and Luke were dependent upon Q and Mark, or is Q simply a figment of scholarly imagination?
So for clarity, or you want to explain?
Sure. So Q is a purely theoretical document. We do not
That
have
nobody knows.
What's that?
That nobody knows.
That nobody knows. Yeah.
QAnon. That's his full name. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
That is not
My
true.
cornea is almost disconnected and rolling my eyes that hard. So, Q in biblical theory is a completely theoretical document that has been proposed as a way to explain why the synoptics have so much in common.
Okay, back up again. What's synoptic? Because not everybody knows the synoptic
totally
problem.
great call. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the synoptic gospels because of how much they have in correlation with one another, versus John doesn't share nearly the same, if hardly at all.
Hardly. There's very few that are in all
John
four.
is very much on a different camp, versus Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot of shared common stories, even ways of saying things. And so to explain this, there have been a number of theories put forward, Q being one of them, that there may have been some early source that then all the authors of those gospels were using as kind of a guide to remember to use these stories, and then they worked them into their own in different orders. And so that makes sense. Some of the support for having such documents, Luke begins his gospel where he says, many have undertaken the attempt to try to write this. And so it was clearly understood even by Luke's day, there were other people trying to write these documents about Jesus. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to assume there was one. And so then to talk about it, we've said maybe there was one that these three guys used in commonality, and they've just labeled it the theoretical Q document. Other scholars think Mark was first, and then Matthew and Luke heavily borrowed from him. I'm not sure if I'd even lean towards that one, but that's just to define some terms.
Interesting is the thought that Mark was the first one doesn't discount Q.
No.
Because people say there was Mark and Q.
Yeah.
Not that Mark was Q, because I think upon Mark, okay, so this person says Q and Mark. I didn't know if the question said Q or Mark.
Yeah.
So that camp would say there was Mark and there was Q.
Yeah.
But if you listen to the Bema podcast, Marty Solomon says Matthew is first, and it's actually early church said Matthew was the first gospel. Augustine thought that. So you have this disagreement over time, that and different thought processes that come and go over time, where this is the first one, that is the first one. Certainly, there are other documents that at least Luke, or sources that Luke is going to.
Yep.
Luke is not one of the disciples who's there.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to look at it and go, Luke's talking to someone.
Yeah.
You have to also think these books are written decades after the time of Jesus.
Yeah.
Not necessarily was everybody a part of.
Yep.
And so there would have been stories that would have been shared in the early church. There were lots of letters written, lots of documentation. Yeah. So I think that absolutely there were other sources. Q could very well have been one of them. Well, would have been one of them, I think, depending on, we just don't know what Q was.
If there was a Q.
I think there probably was it might not have been something that they all went and said, I'm going to the library to get Q's book on Jesus, right? Yeah. I think there were other sources, and probably one of them was a common one that the three of them had. That's what I'm saying, that we could say Q. Yeah. Certainly there was. We don't know what it was. I would say it wasn't a figment of scholarly imagination, is what I'm trying to say.
That's fair. One of my theories I like is that Q maybe wasn't a document, but was a person.
And that's that's kind of where I was going.
And so I think tradition holds that Mark is actually recounting Peter's stories, that he was retelling them, but Peter wasn't qualified to be able to do the writing, but Mark was. And so Mark dictates all of Peter's stories, is kind of what early church tradition holds. Then Peter being the early leader of the church, Luke, who wants to document this, it would make sense. Hey, we got to go talk to this guy. He was one of the disciples. He's leading this movement. Let's go talk to him. So I don't think it would be far out to have an influence like a Peter as a common thread for these stories, especially depending on timing. If there are early church that say Matthew is first, and again, those two probably had some relationship that they would have known each other. So I think they could have been a person just as much as a document.
It probably was a person just as much as a document.
Yeah.
We think of it in 21st century context.
Yeah.
the way that you would go get a source. It would be something from the library.
Yeah.
We don't realize how it was different, right?
Yeah.
Jesus takes Peter, James, and John and goes up the mountain
Yeah.
and the transfiguration. Matthew knows the story.
Yeah.
Somebody told Matthew the story,
Totally.
One of them.
right?
Right?
So
Yeah.
just the simple things like that.
Yeah.
That we have to. I would just encourage whoever asked this question, if you want to hear some interesting stuff on this, the first 10 episodes of season 3 of the Bema podcast, as he's heading into the Gospels, he takes about 10 episodes to just lay the foundation of the world that the Gospels was written in, how the world had changed from the closing of the ending of the Hebrew Bible through the few hundred years into the time of the Gospels, and not just from a Christian perspective, just from a historical perspective.
Yeah.
The rise of the Pharisees, where the Sadducees came from, the Essenes,
Yep.
where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Zealots, who they were, how they came to be, and then also talks about each of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and his theories on how we should approach each of those books and why they're unique and relevant and matter.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, I think that's probably.
We do have one more comment I just caught on from Facebook, if that's not too late. Nathan writes in saying, was that wife in C.S. Lewis, quote, talking about the love between her and her husband, or just love in general that's displayed between her and the world? You just kind of got me wondering about that.
It was in the context of her and her husband, but the quote is certainly, and I absolutely butchered it when I gave it. But the concept, what he's talking about. And I'd encourage everyone to read The Great Divorce. It's just
such a good
short book,
I think it
but
might be my
absolutely
favorite Lewis one.
amazing. Yes.
Yep.
But it's in the context of that relationship. But the truth about how she identifies how inadequately she loved as a human,
Yep.
I think if our hearts are open to it, would challenge and convict every one of us in how often what we say is love is really just us actually trying to take care of ourselves.
Yes.
Right on. Well, with that being said, we will see you guys next week. Make sure to check out our website and keep sending in questions. See you later.